is a bad man, y'all.
Good. All right. Good afternoon. And I don't know why they got me following Zach. Zach is awesome. As you all know, you're just seeing a little bit of Zach. But Zach is awesome.
Thank you, Chester.
My situation here with the Lyde family goes way back. So we've been connected for a long time. When Zach told me about this program, I was telling him, I was trying to talk myself out of it. And then Zach said, no, you got to be involved. So briefly, I'm going to go through some things. My wife tells me I do a better job when I just talk. I got some things to read a little bit, but let's move into this situation here. I am Chester Dunham, and I am the president of the local A. Philip Randolph Institute chapter in Savannah, Georgia, and also host a television talk show. But I wanted to say that labor and civil rights are tied in together. Let me tell you a little bit about labor. And you hear people on television, you're looking in newspaper, everywhere. And number one, it is the American Federation of Labor Congress of Industrial Organization, AFL-CIO. That's labor as a whole. That's big labor. That's labor who they recognize in D.C. That is the group of organization that speaks, whether you're union or not, speaks for everybody who really works for a living. With that group, we have 51 state federations, meaning that in every state in the United States, we have a state fed. Then we have what we call a Central Labor Council. We have over 500 Central Labor Council and thousands of affiliates that connected with that union, which bring us to the total of 11 million plus members. A. Philip Randolph, that's a constituent organization. In other words, they endorse candidates, they do everything. Now they have 6 constituent groups. A. Philip Randolph is one of them. The constituent groups is nonpartisan. Remember, labor partisan, the Institute, just like the NAACP and all of these are nonpartisan. But they are powerful educational tools that try to educate people on issues and all of these other things. So if you listen to them thoroughly, when you get ready to go to vote, you wouldn't make no mistake, because they in and out tell you about the facts of all politicians and how they vote and all of this sort of stuff. So that's that portion of this. Now let's go a little further to President Lincoln. Let's talk about labor. President Lincoln said this. He said, all that serve labor serve the nation. If a man tell you he love America, yet he hate labor, he is a liar. There is no America without labor. Zach just said a few minutes ago, was talking about labor and what slaves and what we did to build this country. Now these were oligarchs. Woodrow Wilson said this. He said, while we are fighting for freedom, we must see, among other things, that labor is free.
Amen.
Now, those are, President talked about labor. Now let's talk a little bit about organized labor.
All right now.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt said, if I was a worker in a factory, the first thing I would do would to join a union.
Amen.
President Eisenhower said, only a fool will try to deprive a working man and women of their right to join unions. These are people understood the importance of unions and organized labor. Let us look at what labor have given us talking about organized labor now. It given us the collective bargain law, which is we call the Norris-LaGuardia Act of 1932. From that act, it gives us the National Labor Relations Act, the National Labor Relations Board, the Wagner Act, Legal Services, the Railway Act, the Taft-Hartley Act, the Labor Management and Disclosure Act of 1959, labor management relation in the federal, state, and local services, postal workers, wages, hours, remember now, wages and hours and working conditions standard. Because one time long ago we didn't have none of that. But it was the pressure of organized labor that did all of these things and many other things that labor contributed. And many more that we are dealing with today. Now let us talk about a great man.
Deal with it.
Which a lot of folks really don't understand or know about. We know about the history of Dr. King.
That's right.
Who was great. The situation here is that even young or old, we still know about Dr. King and his contribution and what he contributed. But it was a forerunner. It was a person way ahead of Dr. King, which brought Dr. King on the scene. And that man was A. Philip Randolph.
Absolutely.
A. Philip Randolph was the greatest black labor leader in American history and the father of the modern day civil rights movement.
That's right.
Mr. Randolph was not a Pullman, but he organized the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. And he took them from, it was 1925 to 1935, 10 years to organize the Pullman, and 2 years to negotiate a contract, 12 years in all. When the Pullman company, the richest company in the United States, said it was not going to happen, it will never happen that they will sit down and bargain with with Pullman porters. Now that sounds strange, but today, white people, black people, Asian, I don't care who you are, catch the devil right now trying to negotiate or organize today. That's why I try to tell my white brothers and all a lot of time, labor was that vehicle that speak for working people and still is that voice that's speaking for working people. But let's look at the situation here where we have racism, and it's a fact everywhere, even in the labor movement. Today, and we do a lot of things, but we still have a lot of racism and racist problem and situation within the labor movement. A. Philip Randolph came on the scene and understood, and he broke the situation because at that time, white, which was the AFL-CIO, American Federation of Labor, CIO, Congress of Industrial Organization, two federations that eventually merged, but at one time they were separate. They segregated against each other. The American Federation thought that we were skilled, had more skill in all the other things, so we were head and shoulder above the other average little worker. I tell white folks this all the time. Congress of Industrial was just regular working people, so we degrade them. So you had racism everywhere. So when A. Philip Randolph came on the scene, now remember, after Randolph organized the Pullman, it gave him a lot of clout, it gave him a lot of power. He looked at the situation and said that we are fighting a war. Now remember, Randolph years ago, even with Woodrow Wilson in World War I. And that's another story that argued against it, went to jail before they went to fight in that war, because he said when they come back home, they'll be treated as, the people over there would be treated better than they were, because they'll downgrade us and belittle us and all these other kind of things. So what happened is World War II. Randolph believed in World War II, but the situation where blacks could not receive a job at no plant. They were making planes, ships, tanks, everything. Blacks, the door were closed to them, couldn't get a job. He threatened to march on Washington in 1941. After he threatened to march on Washington, when the president, who was President Roosevelt, knew that he was serious, then he sent his wife, who was a friend of Randolph, to go to New York to speak with Randolph. But the bottom line is he brought him in. Randolph came in with a small group with the president of the NAACP and 2 or 3 others, and they sat down and talked with the president. And he was trying to get him to call the march off. This is 1941. And Randolph told him the problem was that blacks were discriminated against. They couldn't get jobs in the defense plant. And Roosevelt called in other people, the president of over the labor and all of these other things. But the bottom line is he was trying to get Randolph to call the march off. And Randolph told him that I cannot do. He said, the people will think that I betrayed them. He said, no, we will not do, I would not do that. And from that conversation, they left, shook hands and they left. And when Roosevelt knew that he was serious, Roosevelt called, sent back for Randolph. Randolph came back to Washington, and he signed an executive order 8802, which is on the record book today, dealing with people in the defense industry all over the United States, about meaning now with that executive order, if you refuse these people, now they can take you to court and do all of these other kind of things. That was the first one. 48, our black soldier, individual were going into war, and it was discrimination in the war. He got a lot of complaints, and he moved forward about doing things. So what he did then was challenge President Truman, the Senate at that time, and eventually Truman finally signed another executive order, which it was 9981, I think it was. But anyway, that executive order, meaning that as of now, all service, all branches of the service, the military, everything else, are integrated. And you know you might have on certain situation where we might have to take people to court, but on the law book, that's that executive order. So he did that with 2 presidents. In the 50s, he led 3 marches to Washington about jobs, about justice and all of these things. Now, here was a situation that in 1955, a seamstress, Miss Rosa Parks, who refused to give up her seat this particular day on the bus. Days before, she had give up had got up off the bus, but this day she just refused. From this happening, she was placed in jail. How to tie it in, bringing Dr. King on the scene and Randolph. What happened is the history of this movement. We didn't know anything about, the people during that time didn't know anything about Dr. King. They knew that he was a preacher, and he had just finished in D.C. School in Boston, and came to Montgomery. And eventually they hired him as their new preacher. Wasn't been there 2 or 3 weeks. As he serviced the church for about 3 or 4 months, but now they hired him as their new minister. What happened is that Ms. Park got put in jail. phone call went out to A. Philip Randolph, not to Randolph, but to E.D. Nixon, who was the president of the NAACP and a Pullman poet, and also the chairman of the deacon board of the church where Dr. King was called to preach. That's how this movement started. They decided then, the women's auxiliary in that little town decided they were going to talk about boycotting the buses. And that's what they had a meeting. The first meeting they had, the second meeting, Mr. Nixon went to Mr. Randolph. I mean, not Randolph, but Dr. King, and asked him what they were planning on doing, and asked him would he come to a particular meeting that they were planning. And Dr. King said, Mr. Nixon said, you know, I don't know nothing about the movement, I don't know nothing about this and that. He said, I'm young and I'm new here. He said, that's one of the main reasons why we want you, because you're new and you have all of these other things. But eventually, they got all of the leaders in that area, and eventually Dr. King decided to meet with them. And in that meeting, that's how Dr. King got started in the movement. Now, the situation here is that all of these things happen. Now, they decide then, President Kennedy was the president, and he would put together a civil rights bill. You know, wasn't too much to it, but he was trying to do something because of the situation happening in the South. What triggered the whole thing was in Birmingham, with the 4 little children got with the church bombing. Again, Randolph was trying to tell the leaders about another march. Eventually, Randolph called in 5 organizations, NAACP, SCLC wasn't SCLC at that time, but it was Dr. King, Mr. Randolph, the Urban League, and those, and young John Lewis, and they called them in a meeting. They went to Washington, sit down with President Kennedy. President Kennedy was trying to talk them out of it because he said he had this civil rights bill he was trying to get passed, and he needed the Southern votes and all of this sort of thing. But the long story here is that they couldn't do anything with them, and President Kennedy said, well, I wish you all good luck and all of this sort of stuff. So they had this march. This is the big march. Was the march, 1963. They had people from all over, all organizations, different colors, different groups, decide to come together as one. They decided then that they will have this program. Now, we know about Dr. King and the I Have a Dream speech, which was, as we all know, that was the speech. But Dr. King was an orator plus a minister, and tied all of this in together like Zach was doing not too long ago. You can tell the minister, the preacher part of it. Randolph was one of the greatest orators that during that modern time. So what happened is there was 10 speakers. We only talked about one. The first speaker was Martin Luther King, and the last was Dr. King. A. Philip Randolph. I'm going to just say it, and I'm going to sit down for a little bit of Randolph's speech. And Randolph's speech went like this. He said, we are gathered here today in the greatest demonstration in the history of this nation. He said, let the world know the meaning of our numbers. We are not a mob. We are not a pressure group. But we are the advanced guard of a massive moral revolution touching every town, every village, every hamlet where blacks are segregated against. And at the end of his speech, he said, but we'll be back again and again, and even greatest numbers, until total freedom is ours. That's mostly what happened, and we're still battling and fighting these things today with the movement of the civil rights struggle. That's what I wanted to let y'all know. Oh yes, and then right now, this week, I know a lot of y'all heard it, next week, we will be in Memphis, Tennessee, celebrating the 50th anniversary during the time when Dr. King was assassinated. That's what happened. And Dr. King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, protecting and fighting for the sanitation workers, people who work for a living. That's what that's when he gave up his life. But the key thing about this thing about Dr. King is Dr. King, the day before he died, I've got to say this, just before then, he got on the plane. I know y'all heard this. But the public, the captain came on the system and said that we are sorry for the delay, but we have Dr. Martin Luther King aboard the plane, and we wanted to make sure that we guard this plane all night. We checked, and we did everything to protect his life because we heard about a threat on his life and all of these other things going to be happening. And Dr. King, that next morning, that next night, he was supposed to speak, but he was feeling bad. He had a cold. He was feeling bad. He didn't want to speak. He was telling the people that he was sending Reverend Abernathy in his place because he was feeling bad, but they wanted to hear Dr. King. And Dr. King came that night to speak. And he said that like everybody else, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. He said, but I'm not concerned about that now. He said, all I want to do is do God's will, and he had allowed me to go to the mountaintop. He said, and I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but you as a people will get to the promised land. And that was the end of the speech that Dr. King did before. The next day, or whatever he was, the next afternoon, he was assassinated. Thank you very much.
All right. We want you to know that we organized this because we are definitely set on making sure we organize every hamlet,